The source of this ill-starred lucidity which characterizes the last stages of ontological sickness is not difficult to discover. It is the increased proximity of the mediator. Enslavement is always the final result of desire, but at first it is very distant, and the desiring subject cannot perceive it. The eventual result becomes increasingly clear as the distance between mediator and subject decreases, and the phases of the metaphysical process are accelerated. Every metaphysical desire thus tends toward masochism, because the mediator is always growing nearer, and the enlightenment which he brings with him is incapable by itself of curing ontological sickness. This insight only provides the victim with the means of hastening the fatal evolution. Every metaphysical desire proceeds toward its own truth and toward the desiring subject's awareness of this truth. Masochism occurs when the subject himself enters into the light of this truth and eagerly collaborates in its advent. Masochism is founded on a profound but still insufficient intuition of metaphysical truth, a deviated and perverted intuition whose effects are even more harmful than the innocence of previous stages. When the desiring subject perceives the abyss that desire has hollowed out beneath his feet, he voluntarily hurls himself into it, hoping against hope to discover in it what the less acute stages of metaphysical sickness have not brought him. In practice, it is sometimes difficult to distinguish true masochism from the unconscious and diffuse masochism found in all forms of metaphysical desire. It is a fact that Don Quixote and Sancho are never happy unless they are being beaten black and blue. Idealistic readers hold Cervantes responsible for the prodigious beatings his hero receives. Modern readers, more, quote, lucid, end of quote, more, quote, realistic, end of quote, than the first romantics, are wont to consider Don Quixote a masochist. The two contrary opinions are opposite twin forms of the romantic error. Don Quixote is no more a masochist in the strict sense of the word than Cervantes is a sadist. He is imitating his mediator, Amadis of Gaul. In the case of Julian Sorel, there is already more reason for doubt. The adolescent could live in comfort with his friend Fouquet, but instead he comes to the Hotel de la Mole to expose himself to the scorn of aristocrats who are inferior to him. Again, what is the meaning behind the furious passion which derives solely from Mathilde's disdain and cannot outlive it? Between the desiring subject who submits with resignation to the unpleasant consequences of mediation and the subject who seeks them out avidly, not because they give him pleasure, but because for him they have the value of a sacrament, all shades of the spectrum are possible. There is no clear division between the pre-masochism of Don Quixote and the unquestionable masochism of Marcel or the underground hero. Above all, one cannot be classified as, quote, normal, end of quote, and the other as, quote, pathological, end of quote. The dividing line between sickness and health is always arbitrary and is drawn by our own desires. The great novelists erase this line and thus abolish yet another barrier. No one can say where a repulsive masochism begins in so-called, quote, legitimate, end of quote, ambition, and a noble hunger for what is risky leave off. Every reduction of the distance between the mediator and the subject is a step in the direction of masochism. The passage from external to internal mediation has itself masochistic implications. Unsatisfied with a mediator who is only a figurehead, men choose like the frogs of the fable an active mediator who slashes them to pieces. Enslavement always implies masochism since it is based on the obstacle which a rival's desire puts in our way. Since the slave is glued to that obstacle like a limpet to a rock. Masochism clearly reveals the contradiction which forms the basis of metaphysical desire. The impassioned person is seeking the divine through this insuperable obstacle, through that which by definition cannot be crossed. It is this metaphysical meaning which has escaped most psychologists and psychiatrists. Often the subject is said simply to desire shame, humiliation, and suffering. No one has ever desired any such thing. Every victim of metaphysical desire, including the masochist, covets his mediator's divinity. And for this divinity, he will accept, if necessary, and it is always necessary, or even seek out, shame, humiliation, and suffering. He hopes that misery and suffering will reveal to him the person whom he should imitate in order to free himself of his wretched condition. But these deluded people never desire, purely and simply, shame, humiliation, and suffering. The masochist cannot be understood unless we recognize the triangular nature of his desire. The conception has always been of a linear desire, and starting from the subject, the sempiternal straight line is traced. And this line always runs into the familiar disappointments. I want to spell that word sempiternal because I've never seen it before. Sempiternal. And I'm going to read the sentence with it again. The conception has always been of a linear desire, and starting from the subject, the sempiternal straight line is traced, and this line always runs into the familiar disappointments. These, in turn, are thought to be the object of his desire. It is asserted, in short, that the masochist desires what we would never desire. Another difficulty with this definition is that it renders impossible any distinction, even theoretical, between metaphysical desire in general and masochism in the proper sense of the term. Masochism is diagnosed, in fact, anytime the observer sees the connections between desire and its disastrous results. And it is taken for granted that this connection is perceived by the subject, even though in the higher and earlier stages of mediation he is completely unaware of it. Only when the subject is aware of the connection can we speak of masochism, if the term is to retain an exact theoretical meaning.